HUDSON MCQ UGTRB Part 2. The study of literature through time is called literary history. Each literary age has its own dash and function. Taste and function. Changes in literary taste lead to new movements, school, styles, all the above. Literary periods often overlap because of history flows continuously. According to Arthur, when a literary age ends, taste changes. Literary study helps understand a nation's dash. Inner life. Literature is the dash of a nation's mind and spirit. Expression. Literature records the nation's dash. Inner life. Even great writers are shaped by society, history, culture, all the above. Literary history studies both writers and forces. A literary work should never be studied in isolation from dash. Its age, its language, its culture, all the above. The Renaissance brought enthusiasm from dash classical cultural. Greek, Roman. Medieval revival influenced writers like dash. Coleridge and Scott, both A and B. According to HUDSON, what two main elements must literary history examine? Writers and forces. A great writer influences literature mainly by creating new and dash. Taste. The transformation of literature occurs mainly from one dash to another. Age. HUDSON compares literature to the dash of a nation. Autobiography. According to HUDSON, ordinary history records a nation's dash. Actions. Literature reveals the dash life of a nation. Intellectual. Beowulf is believed to have been right around dash century. 8th century. The story of Beowulf originally developed among people living in Denmark and Sweden. Which Anglo-Saxon writer recorded the story of Cardamom? Bede. Cardamom lived during dash century. 7th century. Which Anglo-Saxon poet wrote religious poetry after a vision of the cross? Cynewulf. Which work of Cynewulf deals with the discovery of the true cross by Helena? Helen. Old English poetry usually divides each line into how many sections? 2. King Alfred translated several works into dash language. English. The ecclesiastical history of the English people was originally written in Latin. Which type of literature was most common during the early medieval period? Religious. Which early English work narrates biblical history along with the legends of saints? Cursor Mundi. Who is regarded as the first great national poet writing in Middle English? Chaucer. Chaucer. Chaucer mainly wrote in dash form of English. Middle English. The rise of Middle English literature is closely connected with the dash poet. Chaucer. Which historical movement greatly influenced the literature of the Elizabeth period? Renaissance. The age of Shakespeare is often called as the dash age. Renaissance age. Which literary form flourished most during the age of Shakespeare? Drama. John Milton lived approximately between 1608 to 1674. John Dryden lived approximately between dash 1631 to 1700. Alexander Pope lived approximately between 1688 to 1744. The age of Johnson roughly extends from 1745 to 1798. Samuel Johnson lived approximately between 1709 to 1784. William Wordsworth lived approximately between 1770 to 1850. The publication of lyrical ballads in 1798 marked the beginning of Romantic movement. The age of Tennyson roughly covers dash years 1832 to 1887. Alfred Tennyson lived approximately between 1809 to 1892. The age of Tennyson corresponds to dash historical period. Victorian age. Victorian literature often deals with the dash theme. Social issues. The Romantic poets emphasized dash elements strongly in poetry. Imagination. Which age in literature emphasized reason, order and satire? Augustan age. Which literary movement reacted against strict classical rules? Romanticism. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in dash ancient culture. Greek and Roman. Which writers were inspired by the medieval revival mentioned by HUDSON? Coleridge and Scott. Literary movements often arise due to the influence of great writers, social change, cultural ideas, all the above. According to HUDSON, literary and life are always dash connected. Which Old English poem describes the crucifixion of Christ through the voice of the cross? Dream of the Rod. Old English poetry mainly developed in North. Old English prose developed mainly in South. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was written in dash language. Old English. Which Anglo-Saxon historian wrote at Jarrow in Northumbria? Bede. Which literary feature replaced alliteration in many later English poems? Rhyme. Which early English poem preserved the alliterative style of Old English verse? Brute. The poem Brute tells the legendary history of dash country. Britain. Which early English work consists of religious homilies written in verse? Harmulum. Which early English prose work was written for women entering religious life? Anchor Rival. Anchor Rival was written approximately around dash year 1225. The poem Owl and the Nightingale is important because it introduced rhyme. Which work written in 1303 deals with moral and religious instruction? Handling Sinne. Who wrote Handling Sinne? Robert Manning. The period between the Norman conquest and Chaucer is most important for the development of dash. Language. Modern English developed mainly from the mixture of dash tool language. Anglo-Saxon and French. Which dialect gradually became the standard form of English? East Midland. Which city played a major role in spreading the East Midland dialect? London. Which universities also supported the East Midland dialect? Oxford and Cambridge. The influence of Chaucer helped establish dash dialect as the standard literary English. East Midland. After the Norman conquest, which language became dominant among the ruling class in India? French. During the medieval period, which language remained the language of the church and scholarship? Latin. The revival of English literature began mainly during the reign of Dash King John. Which literary period follows the age of Chaucer according to HUDSON's table? Chaucer to Total Miscellany. Which literary form flourished greatly during the Elizabethan period? Drama. Which age is associated with the flourishing of English Renaissance literature? Age of Shakespeare. Which historical movement brought enthusiasm for classical Greek and Roman literature? Renaissance. Which literary age followed the age of Shakespeare? Age of Milton. Which age in English literature is known for the influence of Puritan ideas? Age of Milton. Which age followed the age of Milton according to HUDSON? Age of Dryden. The age of Dryden corresponds with dash political restoration in England. Stuart Restoration. Which literary age emphasized satire and reason in literature? Augustan Age. Which age in English literature associated with Alexander Pope? Augustan age. Which literary period followed the age of Pope? Age of Johnson. Which literary work published in 1798 started the Romantic movements? Lyrical ballads. Which poet is considered the central figure of the Romantic movement in England? Wordsworth. Which literary age followed the age of Wordsworth? Age of Tennyson. Which poet became the most representative literary figure of the Victorian age? Tennyson. According to HUDSON, literature must always be studied in relation to the dash of age. Society. Literary schools are formed mainly through the process of imitation. Which poet perfected the classical style of verse that influenced many later poets? Pope. Which earlier poet greatly influenced Alexander Pope's style of poetry? Dryden. Which writer's historical novels helped inspire the Romantic movement in fiction? Scott. Which literary influence strongly affected English writers during the Elizabethan age? Italian literature. Which foreign literature strongly influenced English writers in the late 17th century? French literature. Which European literature influenced English writers during the Romantic period? German literature.